Close on Harriet's face. She stands at the edge of a rutted dirt road in Greenvale County, New York, and the farmhouse ahead looks like something that surrendered a long time ago. The roof has buckled on the east end, dropping at a steep angle where a supporting beam finally gave way. The porch is gone, not just rotted but collapsed inward, leaving a gap where the front entry used to be. For windows on the upper floor are dark, empty squares, the glass broken out by weather or decades of simple neglect. Tall grass and thistle have swallowed what was once a stone path to the door. She is 72 years old. She paid $8 for this property at a Greenvale County tax auction on a gray Thursday morning. And when the auctioneer read her bid aloud, two men near the back of the small crowd laughed. She heard one of them say it plainly, $8 for that wreck. 3 weeks before she stood in that field, a woman named Delia Croft had her removed from the home Harriet had lived in for 31 years. Delia had smiled doing it, and now Harriet stood in tall grass in front of a condemned farmhouse, holding a key her husband Arthur had left her, knowing something Delia would never imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from the city had taken just over 90 minutes, the roads narrowing steadily as she moved north through Greenvale County. 4 lanes became 2, became cracked blacktop, became this final stretch of packed dirt running between walls of old-growth hardwood. October had turned the maples rust and amber. The sky was flat and white. Harriet drove it in silence. No radio, just the sound of the road and the sound of her own breathing, and she spent most of those 90 minutes thinking about Arthur and about the note. She reached into her coat pocket and took it out again. A single folded page in Arthur's careful print, slipped inside the property deed the week before he signed it over to her name, 6 months before his death. She had found it 3 days ago, while going through the papers Mr. Wyndham handed her at the will reading. She'd almost missed it. The sheet was thin, folded twice, easy to mistake for a blank page tucked in by accident. It wasn't blank. Hattie, you'll look at this land and see what's broken. Don't. What matters is underneath. The farmhouse was built in 1908 by a man named Clement Fenwick. His daughter, Serafina, used the cellar for 30 years. I found out what she kept down there in 1987 when I first bought the deed, and I've been paying the county taxes ever since. Everything you need is in the iron room. The key on the brass ring opens the door behind the east wall. Trust what you find. I always trusted you with everything that mattered to me. This is the last thing. Arthur. She had read it 4 times on the drive up. She still didn't fully understand it. An iron room. A woman named Serafina Fenwick. 1987, which meant Arthur had held this secret for over 30 years, through every conversation and every quiet dinner and every night they had lain side by side in the dark talking about the future. She tried to feel something like betrayal and couldn't get there. Because Arthur Crane had never been a careless man. In 44 years of marriage, she had never once known him to keep something back without a reason that turned out to be worth the wait. She put the note back in her pocket and walked toward the farmhouse. Up close, the building was in worse shape than it looked from the road. The front was impassable, so she moved along the south wall, trailing her fingertips along the stone foundation as she went. The stonework was old and very thick, laid by hand, and even now it held firm. She could feel that through her palm. Whoever had set these stones had built for permanence, for something that would outlast the walls stacked on top of it. The east side of the house had a secondary door. Narrow, set deep into the wall, sheltered by a small overhang that had kept the worst of the weather off the wood. The planks were dark and swollen, but intact. She tried the door and it held. She pulled out the key from Arthur's envelope. Old iron, heavy for its size, hand-cut by the look of it, and fitted into the lock. It resisted, then turned with a grinding drag that left rust on her fingers. Inside, the air was cold and still. Old wood, damp earth, and something else underneath those things she couldn't name right away. She let her eyes adjust. The room she'd stepped into had once been a back parlor. Low ceiling, wide plank floors, a stone fireplace set into the north wall. Most of the plaster had come down. Wooden lath showed through in long strips, but the floor held solid under her feet, and when she looked up at the structural beams overhead, she could see they were good still. Massive hand-hewn oak, the kind not cut anymore. She crossed the parlor toward the east wall, and she stopped. Behind a section of collapsed shelving, half buried under a fallen ceiling board, was a door. Iron, set flush into the stone foundation itself, not into the wood frame of the wall above. No handle, only a keyhole, and carved into the iron face around that keyhole, by someone who had taken their time, was a bird. Wings spread, head back, rising from what looked like a low-carved flame. Harriet stood in the cold of that ruined room and looked at the door and understood, for the first time since she'd walked out of Mr. Wyndham's office with $8 less in her purse, that Arthur had not left her ruins. He had left her something he had guarded for 30 years. She still didn't know what it was. She reached into her coat pocket for the brass ring. Arthur Crane had built a seed distribution company from a borrowed truck and a list of 40 farmers he'd cold called over 2 winters in the late 1970s. By the time their son Gregory was born, the company had a warehouse. By the time Gregory started school, it had 3. Harriet ran the books from the beginning, not as a favor, not as a hobby, but because she was better at it than anyone Arthur ever hired, and they both knew it. She managed accounts, handled supplier contracts, sat across from bank officers when the loans got large enough to make Arthur's hands sweat. She did not have a title. The company was Arthur's name on the door. But there was not a financial decision made in 30 years of Crane Agricultural Supply that did not pass through her first. When Gregory was 34, he married Delia Walsh at a vineyard in the Finger Lakes on a Saturday in September. Harriet wore blue. The ceremony was short, and the reception ran long, and Harriet spent most of it watching her new daughter-in-law work a room. Delia was 29, sharp-featured, quick with a laugh, the kind of person who made everyone she talked to feel like the most interesting person present. Harriet watched her move from table to table and thought, "She is very good at this." She did not say it to Arthur. Gregory died 14 months after the wedding. A car accident on a rain-slicked road outside Albany, a November night, a truck that crossed the center line. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. Harriet does not talk about that year. What she will say, to anyone who asks, is that she and Arthur survived it by staying close and staying busy, and that the grief did not break them because they did not let it sit still. Delia stayed. That was the part Harriet hadn't expected. She had assumed, without ever saying it, that Gregory's death would end their connection to Delia naturally. Instead, Delia became a fixture. She came for Sunday dinners. She called Arthur on his birthday, and on Gregory's birthday, and on the anniversary of the accident. She brought him things, a book he'd mentioned once in passing, a bottle of the wine from the vineyard where the wedding had been held. Arthur called her family. Harriet smiled and said nothing. She was not cruel to Delia. She was never cold. But she watched, and over 8 years she assembled a quiet picture of a woman who was very careful about what she showed and who she showed it to. Delia was warm with Arthur in a way that cost her nothing. She was civil with Harriet in a way that cost her something small. It was a thin difference. Most people would have missed it. Arthur did not get sick so much as he got slower. His heart first, the doctors said, then his kidneys, then everything in the way that happens when a body begins winding down. The last 2 years he moved carefully, tired easily, spent more hours in his chair by the window than he ever had. Delia visited more during those years. She drove him to appointments when Harriet was locked in a supplier dispute. She organized his medications once, helpfully, during a bad week when a respiratory infection kept Harriet in bed for 5 days. Arthur died on a Wednesday morning in March. Harriet was holding his hand. The will reading was scheduled 3 weeks later in Mr. Wyndham's office on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Albany. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. Harriet wore gray. Delia arrived 7 minutes late in a black coat that fit well, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes dry in the way of someone who had either already cried in private or decided not to start. Mr. Wyndham read in the flat voice of a man who has delivered news like this many times and learned to stay out of it. The company went to Delia. The house on Birchwood Lane, where Harriet had lived for 31 years, raised Gregory, hosted 40 Thanksgivings, kept the books of a business through 3 recessions, went to Delia. The savings accounts. The investment portfolio Arthur had built over 4 decades of careful work. All of it to Delia. Mr. Wyndham paused and looked at Harriet over the top of his glasses. There was one additional item, he said. A property in Greenvale County. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a deed to 11 acres of land and a farmhouse built in 1908, last assessed by the county at a value of $8 due to its condemned status. A key was taped to the inside cover on a small brass ring. Delia leaned over and looked. Then she laughed, short, bright, caught quickly but not quickly enough. $8, she said. She looked at Harriet with something that was almost sympathy and wasn't. Arthur always did have a sense of humor. Harriet picked up the folder and the key. She looked at Delia for a moment. Then she stood, nodded once to Mr. Wyndham, and walked out. Behind her, she heard Delia say something to the lawyer, voice dropping to a murmur, and then she heard her laugh again. Harriet did not slow down. She took the elevator alone, pushed through the glass door to the street, and sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes without moving, reading Arthur's handwritten note for the very first time. By the time she started the engine, her hands were steady. Delia moved fast. 3 days after the will reading, a letter arrived at the Birchwood Lane house from a law firm Harriet had never heard of, informing her that as the new property owner, Delia Croft required the residence vacated within 30 days. The letter was polite. The deadline was firm. Harriet read it at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Arthur had eaten breakfast for 3 decades, and set it down flat without crumpling it. She spent those 30 days being careful and deliberate. She went through every room and decided what was hers by history rather than law. The furniture was Arthur's, technically, which meant Delia's now. But the boxes of household records going back to 1989, the filing cabinet from Arthur's first office that he'd kept in the basement, the framed photograph of Gregory at 12 standing in front of the company's first proper warehouse, those she wrapped and packed and loaded into the back of her sedan without asking anyone's permission. On the 28th day, she drove away from Birchwood Lane for the last time. She did not look in the mirror. A woman named Cecily Marsh, who had been Harriet's closest friend for 20 years and who taught second grade and baked bread on Sunday afternoons, gave Harriet the spare room in her house on Dunning Street without being asked. She simply called the day after the will reading and said, "You'll stay here." Harriet said she didn't want to impose. Cecily said something short and definitive, and that was the end of the conversation. It was Cecily who found the auction listing. She came home one evening with a printout folded in thirds and set it on the table next to Harriet's tea without a word. Greenvale County tax auction. 11 parcels of unclaimed or tax-delinquent land going up for bid on the first Thursday of November. Among them, 11 acres on County Road 7, including a structure assessed at $8, condemned, no utilities, access by unpaved road only. Minimum opening bid, $1. Harriet read it twice. Then she read Arthur's note again. Then she looked at the deed Mr. Wyndham had handed her in that folder. The deed to those same 11 acres, already in her name, signed over by Arthur before his death. She already owned it. The auction had no bearing on her title, but she went anyway because she needed to see who else was watching that land, and because she had learned long ago that showing up in person told you things a piece of paper never could. She arrived at the Greenvale County Municipal Building at 8:40 on a Thursday morning. The auction room was low-ceilinged with folding chairs and a podium and a county clerk named Mr. Farrell who worked through the parcels in order without inflection. There were perhaps 20 people present, mostly men in work jackets, a couple with laptops, 2 who looked like land surveyors eating granola bars near the window. Nobody paid particular attention to a 72-year-old woman in a gray wool coat who sat near the back and said nothing until Parcel 7. Parcel 7 was her 11 acres on County Road 7. Mr. Farrell read the description aloud. Condemned structure. No maintained road access. Last assessed at $8. He called for opening bids. Someone near the front offered $1. A man 2 rows ahead of Harriet offered $3. Then a pause, the kind that meant nobody thought the thing was worth the trouble. Harriet raised her hand and said $8 in a clear, even voice. A short laugh from the man with the laptop. Not loud, just a small exhale through the nose. The man beside him in the work jacket smiled without looking up from his phone. Mr. Farrell waited a few seconds for a higher bid. None came. He said sold, wrote her name in his ledger, and moved on to parcel 8 without ceremony. She paid at the clerk's window in cash and collected her receipt in a small envelope. The woman at the window, who had kind eyes and asked no questions about the amount, told her the property map was folded inside. Harriet thanked her and walked out into the November air. She sat in a municipal parking lot for a while, engine off, hands in her lap. Through the windshield, the sky was the same flat, white it would stay all the way north. She thought about Arthur walking into some county office in 1987, younger than she was now, already carrying this secret, already paying taxes on 11 acres of condemned land he'd told no one about. 35 years of annual payments, no questions asked. She tried to work out how many times he must have decided not to tell her, and then decided that was the wrong way to think about it. Arthur had not kept this from her out of distrust. He had kept it for her out of something closer to faith. She started the engine. County Road 7 took her north through 2 miles of suburban sprawl that thinned steadily to farmland, then to scrub, then to dense old-growth hardwood pressing in for both sides. The blacktop ended near a faded county marker. Packed dirt took over, running between walls of trees whose canopy had thinned enough to let the gray afternoon sky show in pale strips overhead. The maples were burning amber and rust. The road narrowed, then narrowed again, then ended in a clearing where the trees pulled back as if they had agreed, a long time ago, to leave this particular patch of ground alone. And she saw for the first time the farmhouse, collapsed on one end, dark-windowed, swallowed by tall grass and thistle. A ruin by every ordinary measure. She sat with the engine running and looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned the key, stepped out into the cold, and walked toward it. The brass key fit the iron door's keyhole as precisely as if it had been cut for it yesterday. She felt the internal mechanism catch, then yield, a clean, well-engineered movement for a lock that had not been touched in years. The door itself took more effort. She braced one hand flat against the stone foundation and pulled, and the iron came toward her on hinges that protested with a low sound that was more vibration than noise, felt through her palm before she heard it with her ears. Cold air came out of the opening. Not the damp cold of an ordinary cellar, but something drier and more deliberate, the kind that lives deep underground where temperature has been managed rather than simply left alone. Steps descended into the dark below. Stone, by the look of them, though she couldn't see far. No light came from beneath. She stood at the threshold for a moment and listened. The only sound was a faint movement of air past her through the stairwell, the slow, steady breath of whatever lay at the bottom. She needed a light. Harriet eased the iron door back to its original position without latching it, leaving it open a few inches, and returned to the parlor. She had a small flashlight in her bag, the kind she kept in the glove compartment out of long habit, a habit Arthur had drilled into her after she'd been caught in a darkened parking garage 20 years back. It wasn't much. It would do for a first look. While she was at her bag, she took out a small spiral notebook and a pen. Also habit. She had kept notes on everything her whole adult life. Supplier negotiations, conversations with doctors, details of contracts she wanted to remember precisely. Standing in the ruins of a farmhouse her dead husband had left her was not going to be any different. She went back through the parlor, but not directly to the iron door. She took her time with the rest of the ground floor first. The room north of the parlor had been a kitchen. The iron range was still there, bolted to the floor, its surface thick with rust, but structurally intact. A wooden work table along the west wall had partially collapsed, but the shelving above it still held, and on those shelves sat a row of glass, canning jars clouded with age, and beside them a stack of folded cloth, so old it had gone the same brown as the wood around it. Above the range someone had hung a small framed card, hand-lettered in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. She brought the flashlight close. The Fenwick Farm, EST 1908. CF. Clement Fenwick. Arthur's note had named him. She photographed it with her phone and moved on. A narrow staircase off the kitchen led to the upper floor. She tested each step before committing her weight. 3 were soft enough that she went around them, gripping the wall for balance. The upper landing opened to 2 rooms, both stripped bare except for built-in shelving along the walls. The first room held nothing of note. In the second, she found what she had not known she was looking for. The shelving on the east wall had a gap between the third and fourth sections, roughly 6 inches wide, that didn't match the spacing of the rest. She pulled at the edge of the fourth section, and it moved, not easily, but it moved, swinging outward on a pivot hinge set into the floor and ceiling. Behind it was a recess in the plaster wall, roughly the depth of a shoebox. It had been sealed across the front with a flat board, nailed in and painted over so many times the nail heads had vanished. She worked it loose using her car key as a lever, which took several minutes and cost her 2 fingernails. Behind the board was a tin box, and inside the tin box, wrapped in a piece of wax canvas, a journal. The cover was dark green cloth over boards, worn at the corners, the spine repaired at some point with a strip of adhesive tape, now dried to a curl. On the inside cover, written in a hand that was small and exact and took its time, Serafina Crane Fenwick. March 1931. Harriet sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, flashlight aimed at the page, and began to read. The early entries were practical. Lists of work completed on the farm. Weather observations. Prices paid for feed and hardware in the nearest town, which Serafina referred to only as the village. Then, in an entry dated the 14th of June, 1931, the tone shifted. Father has agreed. We will begin receiving deposits by the end of next month. There are already 3 families confirmed, all referred through the network in the city. I have prepared the lower room as we discussed, and I believe it will hold. Father says we must keep no records naming the families themselves. I say we must keep every record naming the objects, so that when the families return, and they will return, there can be no dispute about what belongs to whom. We have reached a compromise. I will keep this accounting in this journal for my eyes only. No one else will see it until the time makes it right. Harriet read that entry 3 times. 1931. The Depression was grinding through its second year. Europe was tightening. Governments were turning. People were already beginning to move, to flee, to send what they couldn't carry ahead of themselves like messages in bottles thrown into an ocean they weren't sure they'd survive. She sat with that for a moment. Then she closed the journal carefully, tucked it inside her coat against her chest, went back downstairs, and walked to the iron door. She went down slowly, one hand on the stone wall for balance, the flashlight cutting a narrow beam ahead of her feet. The steps were slate, cut from the same bedrock as the Farmhouse Foundation, and they descended in a long straight run before turning once to the right and continuing down. She counted them as she went. 42 steps in total. At the bottom, the flashlight found a wall. Stone like everything else, with a single brass fixture mounted at eye level. She swept the light sideways and found a switch panel, 4 toggles in a row, mounted on a wooden board fastened to the stone with iron brackets. She tried the first one. The lights came on. Not bright, not harsh. A warm amber glow from a series of fixtures running along the top of both long walls, each one a converted oil lamp, housing fitted with an electric bulb. The light was low and even, and it reached every corner of the room without glare. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and let her eyes take it in. The room was large, roughly 50 feet long and perhaps 30 wide, with a ceiling that arched in a single stone vault overhead. Not ornate, not decorative, but carefully shaped by someone who understood that an underground space needed to breathe if it was going to last. The floor was wide slate flags, tight-fitted, smooth underfoot. The air was cool and dry, held that way by a low mechanical hum she traced to a unit mounted high on the far wall. A climate system, not modern but clearly maintained, a piece of equipment that had been serviced and updated in parts over decades. Along both long walls, from floor to near the ceiling, ran a system of oak filing units. Deep drawers at the bottom, open shelving in the middle, glass-fronted cabinets above. Every section carried a small brass plate. Dates, numbers, categories. Running down the center of the room, spaced evenly, were 6 flat oak tables, each with a padded surface and a brass-armed lamp clamped to one corner. Harriet set her bag on the nearest table, pulled out Seraphina's journal, and found the entry she needed near the back of the first third of the book. July 9th, 1931. Our first deposit received today. A family from Broome County. Name withheld per father's rule. They are losing the farm to the bank at month's end. The father brought 3 items. The original land deed from his grandfather's purchase in 1887, a wooden box of letters, and his wife's wedding ring. He asked only that we keep them safe until he can reclaim them. He had heard of us through a man in Binghamton. I gave him a numbered receipt and cataloged the items under number 001. I did not ask what they would do next. I did not need to. She stood with that in her hands for a moment. Japanese-American families during the internment years, sending what they couldn't protect to whatever safe places the network could reach. Seraphina's web had stretched further than upstate New York, further than Harriet had imagined. She kept moving through the drawers. 1938 held deposits labeled in Polish and Czech, small objects wrapped in cloth, envelopes of photographs, a leather-bound prayer book with a name written on the flyleaf in a language she couldn't read. The Depression years of 1932 through 1936 were dense with farm families across the rural Northeast, original land deeds, timber rights documents, letters of title, the paper proof of what people had owned before the banks and the drought years took it. The archive held no chandeliers, no jewelry on velvet. It held something worth more than that. The material record of interrupted lives. The evidence of who people had been and what they had held before circumstances scattered them. She found Seraphina's later journals in a cabinet near the center of the room, 12 volumes in total running from 1931 to 1967. The final entry, written 2 years before the deposit stopped, was short. October 3rd, 1967. I am 71 years old, and my hands are not what they were. I have written to the lawyer in Albany about the custodial arrangement and what happens when I am no longer able to maintain this place. He says the law is clear. The trust passes with the land title. Whoever holds the deed holds the responsibility. I pray to find someone who understands what was built here and why. Father used to say, a promise is only as good as the person keeping it. I have kept it. I can only hope the next keeper will too. Harriet read it twice. Then she closed the journal and stood very still in the amber light of that underground room, surrounded by the careful work of a woman she had never met, thinking about Arthur walking down these same steps in 1987, 34 years after Seraphina wrote those words, finding all of this, and choosing without hesitation to become the next keeper. He had never told her. She had turned that fact over many times since reading his note, and standing here now, she finally understood it. This was not something you told someone about. You showed them. You left it for them to find when the time was right, when the circumstances that had taken everything else away had positioned them to be exactly what this place needed. She walked to the far end of the room, where a separate oak cabinet stood apart from the rest, newer than the others, its brass plate reading simply, Crane. 1987, present. She opened it. Arthur had kept meticulous maintenance records, tax receipts, service logs for the climate system going back to 1991, correspondence with a contractor in Albany who had apparently never asked too many questions. All of it filed with the same care Seraphina had used, the handwriting different, but the discipline identical. Behind the maintenance records, in a folder marked with Harriet's name in Arthur's print, was a second set of documents. These were not about the farmhouse. These were financial records, account statements, transfer logs, internal ledgers from Crane Agricultural Supply. She scanned the top page and felt the air leave her lungs. Money had been leaving the company for years. Quietly, in amounts sized carefully to avoid triggering review, routed through subsidiary accounts into a name she did not recognize, then again into a name she did. She knew that name very well. The name was Delia Croft. Harriet stood in the amber light of the archive and read through the documents in Arthur's folder with the same attention she had given to financial records for 40 years. The transfers had started 8 years ago, small at first, amounts that could be explained as operating expenses or vendor payments to anyone not looking closely. Over time they grew. By the 3rd year, they had a pattern. By the 5th year, the pattern had a name. By the time Arthur died, That name had received just over $840,000 from accounts belonging to Crane Agricultural Supply. Arthur had known. That was the part that took a moment to absorb. He had built this folder, labeled it with her name, and placed it in the one location Delia would never find and never think to look. He had not gone to the police. He had not confronted her. He had gathered the evidence, wrapped it in silence, and left it to Harriet. She stood there for a while, thinking about that. Then she photographed every page with her phone, replaced the documents exactly as she'd found them, and closed the cabinet. She went back up the 42 steps, pulled the iron door shut behind her, reset the collapsed shelving in front of it as best she could, walked out through the east side door, and locked it. She drove back to Cecily's house in the dark, ate the soup left on the stove, washed her bowl, and sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open until well past midnight. The first letter from the county arrived 11 days later. A reassessment notice. Greenvale County had reviewed the valuation of her 11 acres on County Road 7 and found grounds to revise it upward. The new assessed value was $340,000. Back taxes recalculated at that rate, including penalties, came to just over $28,000, due within 60 days. Harriet wrote the number in her notebook and called a lawyer named Phoebe Strand, recommended by a woman in Albany who handled estate disputes, and had said, when Harriet briefly described her situation, that Phoebe was exactly who she wanted. Phoebe was 44, direct, and charged by the hour. Their first meeting lasted 3 hours. Harriet laid out everything: the will, the deed, the archive, the photographed financial records, the reassessment notice. Phoebe listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions at the end. Had the archive's contents been appraised, and was Harriet prepared to move fast? Harriet said no to the first and yes to the second. Phoebe said, schedule the appraisal this week. The second threat came 10 days later. A letter from an organization called the Greenvale Land Preservation Collective informed Harriet that her property had been nominated for protected status under a state agricultural heritage program. If approved, the designation would restrict any development, sale, or modification of the land without committee review, effectively freezing her ability to act on the property for as long as the process ran. The letter was signed by a board chairperson whose name meant nothing to her. She gave it to Phoebe. Phoebe gave it to an investigator she worked with named Gil Novak, who had the look of a man who found other people's financial paperwork genuinely interesting. Gil traced the Greenvale Land Preservation Collective to a registered agent in Albany, the agent to a filing address, and the filing address to a shell company incorporated in Delaware 8 months ago. The shell company connected to a property management firm. The firm's silent partner was Delia Croft. Harriet wrote the name in her notebook and underlined it once. The appraiser Phoebe arranged was a woman named Dr. Elaine Foote from the State University at Albany, who specialized in historical archives and cultural property. She spent 2 full days in the archive with a graduate assistant, cataloging and assessing in silence. When she came upstairs on the second afternoon, she had the look of someone who had revised a number several times in one direction. She told Harriet the archive's contents carried a conservative assessed value of between $4 and $6 million, with several items of historical significance that could attract additional institutional interest. Harriet thanked her and wrote the number down. She moved into the farmhouse the 3rd week of November. A cot and a camp stove in the back room. The security camera Phoebe's office had insisted on mounted above the east door, its feed going to her phone. She worked through Seraphina's remaining journals systematically, cross-referencing deposit records against the catalog drawers, building a complete inventory of what was there and who it had originally belonged to. A woman named Rowena Adler, referred by Phoebe, came twice a week to help with the cataloging. She had managed a nonprofit for 12 years before its own board had pushed her out, and she worked without needing anything explained twice. Phoebe's office filed the legal response to the reassessment. Gil continued pulling at the threads behind the shell company, adding documentation to a file that was growing thicker by the week. The evidence of Delia's embezzlement was organized, copied, and secured in 3 separate locations. By the middle of December, Harriet had done everything she could do from her end. She was ready. She did not know exactly when Delia would come. She knew that she would. A woman who had gone to the trouble of engineering a tax reassessment and incorporating a shell company in Delaware was not going to let the matter sit. She had invested too much to walk away, and she still believed, Harriet was certain, that she was dealing with a 72-year-old woman living alone in a condemned building with no resources and no options. That belief was Delia's only remaining advantage. Harriet intended to let her keep it a little longer. The camera alert came on a Tuesday morning in January. An expensive car turning off the county road onto the dirt track, moving too fast for the ruts. Harriet was already dressed when the camera alert came through. She had been awake since 5, which was not unusual. She had made coffee on the camp stove, read through her notes from the night before, and then, with the deliberateness she brought to everything that mattered, gone to the back room closet and chosen what she would wear. Not the gray dress from the Will reading. Not anything from the boxes she'd packed out of Birchwood Lane. She had driven into town the previous week and bought a simple wool suit in dark navy, well cut, the kind of thing she would have worn to a meeting with a bank officer in the years when she and Arthur were still building something for nothing. Low heels. Her hair set properly. She had looked at herself in the small mirror propped on the windowsill and thought, this will do. She poured the rest of her coffee into the sink, set her notebook square on the counter, and waited. The car took 6 minutes to navigate the dirt track from the county road to the clearing. She watched it on her phone, a white luxury SUV whose undercarriage scraped the high center of the rutted track in 3 separate places she could hear from inside the farmhouse. It stopped in the clearing and sat with the engine running for nearly a full minute before the door opened. Delia stepped out in a long charcoal coat, her dark hair pulled back, her expression arranged into something composed and purposeful. She looked at the farmhouse and stopped. Harriet could see the recalibration from the window. The east side of the building had been cleared of the worst debris. The door was solid. A single exterior light fixture, newly mounted, sat above the entrance. None of it was grandeur, but none of it was the ruin Delia had been counting on. Harriet opened the door before Delia reached it. "You found it," Harriet said. "Come in." Delia stepped inside and stopped again. The back room where Harriet had set up her living space was spare but ordered. The camp stove replaced by a 2-burner unit on a proper work table. The shelving along the walls cleared and cleaned. The wide plank floors swept and treated with linseed oil that had drawn the old grain back to the surface. A reading lamp, 2 chairs, a small heater in the corner running quietly. The room smelled of coffee and cedar and old wood. "You've been living here," Delia said. "Since November." Delia looked at her carefully. Whatever she had worked out on the drive up was not landing the way she'd planned. She tried a different approach. "Harriet, I came because I'm genuinely concerned. This is no place for someone you're." "You came," Harriet said, "because the reassessment didn't hold and the land preservation filing has been challenged, and you need to understand what you're dealing with before you spend more on it." No heat in her voice. She might have been reading from a maintenance log. "Sit down. I'll get the coffee." Delia sat. Harriet brought 2 cups to the table and then brought the first folder and set it between them. Phoebe's reassessment response, the original valuation documentation, the legal basis for contesting the county's revision, and a paper trail connecting the revaluation request to Delia's shell company through 3 documented steps. Delia's face stayed level, but her hands on the table were not quite still. Then Harriet put down Gill's report on the Greenvale Land Preservation Collective. Every link in the chain from the letterhead to the Delaware incorporation to the property management firm to the name at the end of it. Delia looked at it without touching it. "Where did this come from?" "Documented public record," Harriet said. "Available to anyone willing to look." Delia set her coffee cup down. "What do you want?" Harriet stood. "Come with me." She led her through the parlor, moved the collapsed shelving aside without effort or ceremony, and opened the iron door. The lights came on as they descended. She heard Delia's breathing shift behind her on the stairs, and when they reached the bottom and the full length of the archive spread out before them in the amber light, Delia stopped walking. She stood at the foot of the stairs and looked. The oak filing unit's floor to ceiling. The glass-fronted cabinets. The 6 flat work tables running down the center. The the brass date plates marking decade after decade of careful, unbroken keeping. She stood there for the better part of a minute before she said anything. "What is this place?" "This is what you told me Arthur left me as a joke," Harriet said. "Appraised 6 weeks ago at a conservative minimum of $4 million. Mine under custodial trust law, verified and documented." She walked to the crane cabinet at the far end of the room and took out the financial folder. She set it on the nearest work table and opened it to the first transfer record. Arthur kept these. 8 years of documentation. Every transfer, every routed account, every forged authorization, including 2 documents bearing his signature that are dated after the day he died. She turned and looked at Delia directly. "I have copies in 3 places. My lawyer holds 1 set. A second set is currently sitting in an envelope at the district attorney's office in Albany, not yet filed." The archive was very quiet. The climate system ran its low, steady hum, and the amber lamps held, and nothing else moved. Delia's composure had narrowed to something much smaller. "What is it you want?" Harriet told her. "Sign over what remained of Crane Agricultural Supply. Withdraw every legal filing, every challenge, every action connected to this property. Leave Greenvale County. In exchange, the envelope at the district attorney's office would be collected and the matter would be finished. And if I refuse?" "I file the documents tomorrow morning," Harriet said. "And you spend the better part of the next decade explaining those signatures to people who are paid to be skeptical." The silence held. Delia looked at the rows of labeled drawers. She looked at the documents open on the table. She looked at Harriet standing beside them in her dark navy suit, perfectly still, with the patience of someone who had already waited a very long time and had no difficulty waiting a little longer. She looked at the floor. "I'll sign," she said. Delia signed the papers the following morning and left Greenvale County before noon. Someone who knew someone said she'd gone to stay with a cousin in Oregon. Harriet neither confirmed nor pursued it. The matter was finished, and she had other work to do. The agricultural supply company that came back to her was smaller than what she and Arthur had built. Its best contract gone during the embezzlement years. The fleet reduced from 22 vehicles to 9. She gave day-to-day management to a man named Walt Briggs, who had driven for Crane for 16 years and knew the routes and the clients and which suppliers kept their word. She told Walt what she expected. Honest contracts, fair wages, nothing signed that wasn't exactly what it appeared to be. Walt said he'd always run it that way when he could. Now he could. She spent the winter on the farmhouse itself. The archive needed nothing from her but care, and it was getting that. The building above it was another matter. She brought in a contractor from the village with 2 workers, and they spent 6 weeks on the structure. Roof first, then floors, then windows. The 1908 bones were sounder than she'd expected. Clement Fenwick had built the way his daughter had kept records. Nothing wasted, nothing ornamental, everything made to last. By April, the building was weathertight and properly heated. By May, it had 3 working rooms beyond her apartment in the back. The Fenwick Foundation opened the 2nd week of June. Its purpose was specific. It helped people who had been defrauded, cheated out of inheritances, or robbed by those holding legal or financial authority over them. Phoebe Strand took cases pro bono, funded by the careful, limited sale of archive items with no traceable heirs. Gil Novak investigated. Rowena Adler ran the day-to-day with the efficiency of someone who understood through personal loss exactly how much disorganization costs people who can't absorb it. In their first 4 months, they helped recover $600,000 for 9 people whose cases other firms had declined as too complicated or too old. Harriet ran the archive. She had made contact with 2 university history departments and a cultural property lawyer in New York City who handled repatriation claims. Items with documented provenance and traceable family lines were flagged and the search for heirs begun. Most trails went cold, but some did not. On a Thursday morning in late July, a woman drove carefully up the dirt track, parked in the clearing, and sat in her car for several minutes before getting out. Harriet recognized the hesitation. She had seen it before in people who had traveled a long way towards something they weren't entirely sure was real. The woman was perhaps 35, dressed as if she'd come straight from work. She carried a folder. She looked at the farmhouse, restored now. It's 1908 lines clean and solid, a modest sign beside the entrance reading the Fenwick Foundation. And then she looked at Harriet, standing in the doorway. "My name is Yuki Tanaka," she said. "I found your foundation online. I have a receipt. It's very old. My grandmother gave it to my mother, and my mother kept it her whole life, and she passed away last year. I found it going through her things. I didn't know if it would mean anything to anyone, but the address on it," she stopped, held the folder up slightly, as though offering it. "I had to try." "Come in," Harriet said. "Sit down." Yuki opened the folder at the table and laid the receipt flat. The paper had gone translucent at the folds. The ink faded to pale brown. Harriet read it carefully without touching it. Fenwick Station, property of Hannah Tanaka. Deposited February 14th, 1942. One rosewood writing box containing calligraphy brushes and personal correspondence. To be held in trust until claimed. February 1942. 6 weeks before Executive Order 9066. Harriet looked up. "I have this," she said quietly. "Your grandmother's box has been here for 83 years. The air went out of Yuki in a long, slow breath. "You actually have it. Cataloged and preserved since the week it arrived. Come with me." They went down the 42 steps together. In the amber light of the archive, Harriet found drawer 1942, item 204, and lifted out a rosewood box wrapped in its original cloth. She set it on the work table and stepped back. Yuki opened it with careful hands. Inside, resting in silk-gone ivory with age, lay 6 calligraphy brushes of varying sizes, their handles smooth dark wood, their tips still intact after 8 decades in this room. Beneath them, folded twice, a single sheet of paper covered in brushwork. Yuki unfolded it and looked at it without speaking for a long time. "She was a calligrapher," she said finally. "My grandmother. I never met her. But my mother used to say her work was—" She stopped again. Harriet put a hand on her shoulder and said nothing. Some things don't need words placed around them. After Yuki left, driving down the track with a rosewood box wrapped in her jacket on the passenger seat, Harriet sat alone at the work table for a long while. The amber lamps held their light. The oak drawers stood in their rows around her, each one a promise made and kept. 83 years between Hannah Tanaka setting that box down on this ground and her granddaughter lifting it back up. Seraphina Fenwick had kept this place for 36 years. Arthur Crane for 35 after her. Harriet did not know how many years she had left. She intended to use them the same way. She climbed the 42 steps, closed the iron door, and went upstairs to make tea. Outside, the July light was long and gold across the clearing. The old trees stood at the edge of it, the same trees that had stood there in 1908 when Clement Fenwick drove the first foundation stone into this ground, and they would stand there long after Harriet was gone, keeping their own kind of silence over everything buried beneath them. She filled the kettle. She sat down by the window. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.